Who bound the four angels on the banks of the Euphrates? The Euphrates River carries more than water, it carries borders. By its banks passed Assyrian armies, Babylonian kings, Persian conquerors. Its waters witnessed the birth and fall of entire empires. But there is something in that river that no archaeologist has ever unearthed, something that does not appear on ancient maps or in cuneiform tablets. Four beings, bound, held by a force that the biblical text does not name. The Apocalypse mentions their existence in only 3 verses, and in those 3 verses, one of the greatest mysteries of Christian eschatology is hidden. Before continuing with the video, do you wish to strengthen your prayer life and further help our channel grow? I have prepared a material with more than 50 special prayers to guide you. Click on the link in the description and help our project to spread the word of Christ. The text that records this enigma does not come from lost manuscripts or oral traditions distorted by time. It is preserved in chapter 9 of the book of the Apocalypse, verses 14 to 16. The scene takes place during the sounding of the 6th trumpet. Heaven has already been torn by 5 previous judgments. The earth has already felt the weight of devastating plagues. And then a voice emerges from the golden altar that is before God. This voice gives a direct command to the 6th angel. Loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Think on the scene for a moment. Our celestial command pierces dimensions. Chains that held beings for an indeterminate time begin to break. 4 entities that waited in absolute silence finally receive permission to act. And what do? The text is clear. They were prepared to slay the 3rd part of men, 1/3 of humanity. We are not talking about a localized plague or a regional disaster. We are talking about destruction on a global scale. But before advancing to what happens after the liberation, we must return to the question that has tormented scholars for nearly 2,000 years. Who bound them? Who had the authority, power, and capacity to chain 4 beings described as angels beside a river that cuts through the heart of the Middle East? The Euphrates is not just any river in the biblical narrative. It appears for the first time in the 2nd chapter of Genesis as one of the 4 rivers that went out of Eden to water the garden. Its length reaches approximately 2,800 kilometers, rising in the mountains of modern Turkey, crossing Syria and Iraq until it flows into the Persian Gulf. In some points, its width exceeds 400 meters. Its average annual water volume reaches about 900 cubic meters per second, enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool in less than 3 seconds. For millennia, its banks sheltered some of the most powerful civilizations in human history. Sumeria flourished there around 4,000 years before Christ, developing the first known form of writing. Acadia dominated the region about 300 years later, establishing the first empire in history. Babylon, with its hanging gardens considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and its tower that defied the heavens, rose on the banks of this same river. The city reached 200,000 inhabitants at its peak, a metropolis in an era where most cities had only a few thousand people. Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, also depended on the waters of the Tigris, the brother river of the Euphrates. The 2 civilizations developed in the region called Mesopotamia, a Greek word that literally means between rivers. This strip of fertile land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was called the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of agriculture, writing, codified laws, and some of the first organized religions. Consider the historical dimension of this setting. The Euphrates was the natural border between the world known by the Hebrews and the threatening powers of the East. To cross the Euphrates meant entering hostile territory. The Assyrians came from beyond the Euphrates to destroy the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 before Christ. The Babylonians crossed these waters to raise Jerusalem in 586 before Christ. To the Jewish mind, the Euphrates represented danger, invasion, judgment, and it is exactly there that 4 angels wait. The text of the Apocalypse uses the Greek word angeloi, which means messengers. It does not use the word daimon, which would give rise to our term demon. This generates a theological debate that spans centuries. Are these 4 beings fallen angels, rebels who turned against the Creator? Or are they executing angels, designated to fulfill a specific function in the divine schedule? The answer is not simple, and the biblical text itself does not offer an explicit definition. What we know is that they were bound. The Greek word for bound is didemenos, which indicates a state of tying, of forced containment. They were not there by choice. They were not meditating on the riverbanks waiting for instructions. They were held, chained by a force superior to theirs. But who executed this imprisonment? The Bible does not give the name of a celestial jailer. It does not describe an epic battle where an archangel defeated these four beings and chained them. The silence of the text is part of the mystery. However, the context offers important clues. Observe what happens in other passages that deal with imprisoned angels. In the second letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 4, there is a striking statement. God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. The Greek word used here for hell is Tartarus, a term that appears only once in the entire New Testament. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was a subterranean prison for the Titans. Peter uses this concept to describe the fate of rebel angels. The letter of Jude in verse 6 complements this image. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. Again, the image of prison, of chains, of containment until a specific moment. Many scholars connect these passages to the enigmatic episode of Genesis 6, where the so-called sons of God took for themselves wives from among the daughters of men. Ancient Jewish tradition, especially preserved in the Book of Enoch, develops this narrative with impressive details. According to Enoch, 200 angels descended on Mount Hermon, made a pact, related with human women, and fathered a race of giants called Nephilim. The leader of these angels was called Semjaza. Other names are listed: Azazel, who taught men the manufacture of weapons and women the art of cosmetics; Amazarak, who transmitted knowledge of sorcery; Barakijal, who revealed the secrets of astrology. As punishment, these angels were said to have been imprisoned until the day of final judgment. The Book of Enoch describes chains of darkness, abysses of fire, valleys of containment, where they await definitive punishment. The description is visceral, detailed, disturbing. The Book of Enoch is not part of the biblical canon accepted by most Christian and Jewish traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is an exception, including it in its canon. However, it was known and respected in the 1st century. Fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to approximately 150 years before Christ. Jude even directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch in his letter, verses 14 and 15. This shows that traditions about imprisoned angels circulated widely at the time the Apocalypse was written. But here a crucial question arises. Are the four angels of the Euphrates the same angels mentioned in Peter and Jude? Or are they a different group with a specific function in the events of the end times? The text of the Apocalypse offers an important clue. They were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year. This chronological precision is impressive. We are not talking about beings vaguely waiting for an undefined moment. We are talking about an exact date determined before the foundation of the world, marked on the calendar of eternity. Dimension what this means. Every second that has passed since the creation of the universe was a second closer to this moment. Every empire that rose and fell, every war fought, every generation that was born and died, all of this happened while four beings waited, motionless, held, counting a time that only the Creator knows. The mathematics is dizzying. If we assume that these angels have been bound since the flood of Noah, approximately 4,400 years ago, they would have waited about 1,600,000 days, more than 38 million hours, more than 2 billion minutes. Each of these minutes was part of an invisible countdown to a moment that has not yet arrived. And if the imprisonment is even older, if we go back to the original fall mentioned in Isaiah and Ezekiel, we would be talking about a time prior to the creation of man itself, a period of waiting that the human mind cannot conceive, entire geological eras, the emergence and extinction of species, continents moving, and four beings motionless waiting. The author of the Apocalypse is identified as John, exiled on the island of Patmos during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, around the year 95 after Christ. The island of Patmos is in the Aegean Sea, approximately 60 kilometers from the coast of present-day Turkey. It was used by Rome as a penal colony for political and religious prisoners. The island has an area of only 34 square kilometers, smaller than Fernando de Noronha. Rocky, arid, isolated. John was sent there for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus, as he himself records in chapter 1. Tradition indicates that John worked in the island's quarries, breaking rocks under the scorching Mediterranean sun. An elderly man, probably over 80 years old, condemned to forced labor for refusing to deny his faith. And it is in this context of physical suffering and isolation that he receives the most extraordinary visions ever recorded about the end times. The historical context is important to understand the language of the Apocalypse. First-century Christians lived under systematic persecution. Nero had set fire to Rome in 64 after Christ and blamed the Christians for the disaster. Tacitus, a Roman historian, records that thousands were executed in brutal ways, covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified or turned into human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. The smell of burning flesh remained in the air for days. Domitian, at the end of the century, demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, something that Christians could not accept, as they recognized only one Lord. The refusal to participate in the imperial cult brought severe consequences: loss of property, imprisonment, exile, death. The pressure was constant, the threat real and immediate. In this context, the Apocalypse emerges as a coded message of hope. Its symbols were understandable to the original readers, but obscure to the Roman persecutors. And among these symbols, the Euphrates River occupied a special place. For the Romans of the first century, the Euphrates was the eastern border of the empire. Beyond it were the Parthians, feared enemies who had inflicted humiliating defeats on the Roman legions. In 53 before Christ, at the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians destroyed a Roman army of approximately 40,000 men, led by General Crassus. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. The Parthian threat was never forgotten. When the Apocalypse mentions the Euphrates, first-century readers did not think only of ancient geography. They thought of present danger. They thought of invasion. They thought of hordes of eastern horsemen crossing the border and bringing destruction. And it is exactly this image that the text evokes. When the four angels are loosed, what follows is terrifying. Verse 16 describes an army of 200 million horsemen. This number is so absurd for the time that many interpret it as symbolic. In the first century, the total population of the Roman Empire was estimated at about 60 million people. Han China, in the Far East, had approximately 50 million. An army of 200 million would be larger than the entire population of the known world combined. How to visualize an army of this size? If each soldier occupied 1 meter of space and they marched in a single file, the column would extend for 200,000 kilometers. That is enough to go around the Earth 5 times. If they marched side by side in a formation 1,000 soldiers wide, the column would still be 200 kilometers long, greater than the distance between São Paulo and Campinas multiplied by 2. Think in modern terms. All the armies of the world today combined do not reach 25 million active soldiers. The army described in the Apocalypse would be 8 times larger. If each horseman needed only 2 square meters of space, this army would occupy 400 square kilometers, an area larger than the entire city of Curitiba. The text describes the horses with heads like lions, casting fire, smoke, and brimstone from their mouths. The horsemen wore breastplates of fire, jacinth, and brimstone, colors of flame, of bluish smoke, of volcanic destruction. The tails of the horses were like serpents with heads that did hurt. Every detail amplifies the terror. Every image intensifies the devastation. The destruction caused by this army kills the third part of men who had not been killed by the previous plagues. But who controls this army? The 4 angels. Those who were bound by the Euphrates. Those whose imprisonment no one knows exactly who executed, but whose liberation comes directly from a command from the celestial altar. This is the point that many miss when studying this passage. The emphasis of the text is not on the past of the imprisonment. It is not on describing ancient angelic battles or in naming the celestial jailer. The emphasis is on control. It is on precision. It is on the demonstration that even the most destructive forces in the universe operate within limits established by the Creator. Think of the theological implication of this. If these four angels are fallen beings, rebels, enemies of God, even so they are completely subordinate to His will. They cannot act 1 second before the determined time. They cannot kill one person beyond the established number. Their fury is real, but it is a fury on a leash. Their destruction is genuine, but it is a destruction with an expiration date. Some interpreters see here a connection with Daniel chapter 10. In this passage, an angel appears to Daniel and explains that he was delayed 21 days in arriving because the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood him. This prince was not a human ruler, but a spiritual entity that exercised influence over the Persian territory. The angel only managed to pass when Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help him. The idea of spiritual beings associated with specific geographical regions appears in several parts of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 32 speaks of God establishing the borders of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel, with a possible alternative reading that mentions sons of God as entities designated for each nation. Are the four angels of the Euphrates territorial princes? Do they represent spiritual powers that governed the four great powers that came from beyond the Euphrates, Assyria, Babylon, Media, and Persia? This interpretation has its defenders but also its critics. The text simply does not offer enough information for a definitive conclusion. What the text does offer is the certainty that they were under absolute control. And this leads us back to the original question, who bound them? The most honest answer to the biblical text is that we do not know the exact mechanism. We do not know if there was a battle. We do not know if it was an instantaneous decree. We do not know if Michael led a celestial army against them, or if the word of God simply immobilized them where they were. What we know is who has authority over the prison and over the liberation. The command to loose them does not come from a rebel angel. It does not come from a human ritual. It does not come from occult forces manipulating cosmic energies. The command comes from the golden altar before God. It comes from the center of celestial government. It comes from the throne. Throughout the centuries, interpreters have tried to fill the gaps left by the text. Some created elaborate narratives about subterranean caves in the Euphrates region, where these beings would be literally chained. Stories of expeditions that heard strange sounds coming from cracks in the earth. Reports of inexplicable phenomena in specific regions of Iraq. None of these stories have a basis in the biblical text. The Apocalypse does not mention caves. It does not describe specific geological formations. It does not give coordinates for mystery hunters. What the text says is that they were bound in the great river Euphrates. The Greek expression epi to potamo indicates proximity, association with the river, but not necessarily a physical location beneath its waters or in adjacent caves. The most sober interpretation understands that the mention of the Euphrates is both geographical and symbolic. Geographically, it marks the region from which the greatest historical threats to the people of God came. Symbolically, it represents the border between order and chaos, between protected territory and the domain of hostile powers. Now, a detail frequently ignored. The Euphrates appears again in the Apocalypse chapter 16, verse 12. During the pouring out of the sixth vial, its waters dry up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. The connection between the sixth trumpet and the sixth vial does not seem accidental. Both involve the Euphrates. Both prepare for mass destruction. Both point to the climax of divine judgment. In chapter 16, the drying of the Euphrates allows the passage of armies for the Battle of Armageddon. The river that for centuries served as a natural barrier, protecting civilizations from eastern invasions, is removed. The floodgates open. The forces converge for the final confrontation. Observe the pattern. The Euphrates is not just a setting. It is an active participant in the eschatological narrative. Its waters are controlled by the same God who controls the angels who were bound there. When it is time to restrain, he restrains. When it is time to loose, he looses. When it is time to dry, he dries. Everything operates within a schedule. And this is perhaps the most disturbing revelation of chapter 9. The four angels were not simply bound, they were prepared. The Greek word is hetoimasmenoi, which indicates a state of complete readiness. Like soldiers in formation, waiting only for the command to advance. Like athletes on the starting block, muscles tense, ready for the starting shot. They knew what they were going to do. They knew how many were going to die. They knew what their role would be in the larger plan. And they waited. For centuries. For millennia. In absolute silence on the banks of a river that saw empires born and die. The human dimension of this narrative cannot be ignored. When the text says that a third of men would be killed, it is not talking about abstract statistics. It is talking about fathers, mothers, children, grandparents. It is talking about interrupted dreams, shattered families, swept away civilizations. If we applied this proportion to the current world population of approximately 8 billion people, we would be talking about more than 2,600,000,000 deaths, a number so vast that the human mind can barely process it. To put it in perspective, World War II, the deadliest conflict in recorded history, caused between 70 and 85 million deaths in 6 years. The judgment described in Apocalypse 9 would be more than 30 times worse. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, killed approximately 75 to 200 million people over decades. Even so, it would be less than a tenth of the destruction described in this passage. Imagine the impact on a single city. A metropolis like São Paulo has about 12 million inhabitants. A third would be 4 million deaths. That is as if the entire city of Salvador disappeared, or the entire population of Porto Alegre, Curitiba, and Recife combined, in a matter of time not specified in the text, by the power of 4 beings who waited eras for this moment, and all of this was prepared, timed, waiting. The question that emerges is no longer just who bound them, but why keep them there for so long? What is the purpose of such a long imprisonment? What is the meaning of such an extensive wait? Some theological traditions understand that the postponement of judgment is an expression of divine mercy. Peter, in his second letter, chapter 3, verse 9, states that the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Every day that the angels remain bound is an additional day for human repentance. Others see in the prolonged imprisonment a demonstration of sovereignty. God is not in a hurry. He does not operate according to human schedules. 1,000 years are to him as one day, says the same Peter in verse 8. The 4 angels can wait as long as necessary. Their anxiety for destruction does not accelerate the divine clock. There are still those who interpret the imprisonment as part of a process of the maturation of evil. Just as the wheat and the tares grow together until the harvest, according to the parable of Jesus in Matthew 13, the forces of destruction are kept in containment until the time of separation arrives. The liberation of the angels marks not the beginning of judgment, but its climax after a long period of preparation. Regardless of the interpretation chosen, one element remains constant: control. The angels did not escape. They were not liberated by rebel forces. They did not manage to break their chains by their own strength. They remained exactly where they were placed until the competent authority ordered their release. And this authority is not a superior angel. It is not a celestial council. It is the voice that comes from the altar before God. The altar mentioned in verse 13 is significant. In the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, the altar was the place of intercession, of encounter between the human and the divine, of atonement for sins. The golden altar specifically was used to burn incense, a symbol of the prayers of the saints rising to God. In chapter 8 of the Apocalypse, verses 3 to 5, there is an impressive scene involving this same altar. An angel with a golden censer receives much incense to add to the prayers of all the saints upon the altar. The smoke of the incense rises with the prayers. Then the angel takes the censer, fills it with fire from the altar, and casts it upon the earth. There follow thunders, voices, lightnings, and an earthquake. The prayers of the saints are connected to the judgment. This means that when the voice departs from the altar, to order the liberation of the four angels, there is a connection with the prayers accumulated over the centuries. The cries of the martyrs, recorded in chapter 6, asking how long God would wait to avenge their blood, the pleas of generations who suffered injustice, persecution, oppression. The judgment is not arbitrary. It is a response. The four angels are not loosed by divine whim. They are loosed as part of a cosmic response to centuries of human wickedness and the cry of the righteous. The destruction they bring is terrible, but it is not random. It is connected to a process that began long before their liberation. Return now to the Euphrates, the river that bathed Eden, the river that marked borders, the river that witnessed empires, the river that will serve as a stage for eschatological events. It is no coincidence that God chose this specific location to restrain these specific forces. In biblical geography, the Euphrates represents the eastern limit of the territory promised to Abraham. In Genesis 15, verse 18, God establishes the covenant. Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river Euphrates. From the Nile to the Euphrates, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, a territory that Israel historically never fully occupied, but which remains as a promise. The angels are bound on the border of the promise. They are held at the limit between what was given and what was beyond, between the inheritance of Abraham and the territory of the nations, between blessing and judgment. The location is not accidental. It is theological. And when they are loosed, the judgment crosses the border. The forces that were contained beyond the Euphrates advance over all the earth. The containment that lasted eras ends. The army of 200 million horsemen marches. The third part of humanity perishes. There is no historical record that allows identifying when this imprisonment began. The text does not say if it was before the flood, during the dispersion of Babel, in the period of the patriarchs, or at some other moment. Some connect it with the original fall of Lucifer, described poetically in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. Others associate it with the episode of the sons of God in Genesis 6. Others still see it as a specific action for the purposes of the end times, without a necessary connection to past events. The silence of the text is not a failure. It is a choice. The author, under inspiration, could have detailed the origin of the imprisonment. He could have named the jailer. He could have described the battle that resulted in the containment, but he did not. And this omission communicates something. The focus is not on the past, but on the future. It is not on how they were bound, but on what happens when they are loosed. The message for first-century readers was clear. The forces that threaten you are under control. The Parthians beyond the Euphrates, the emperors in Rome, the persecutions in the cities. Nothing happens outside the divine schedule. Even the most terrible angels await permission to act. The message for readers of any era remains the same. There is a throne above all chaos. There is an authority that establishes limits even for destruction. There is a plan that incorporates even the most hostile forces in its unfolding. The mystery of the four angels of the Euphrates is not an enigma to be solved with creative speculation. It is not a puzzle that needs invented pieces to be completed. It is a partial revelation that points to a greater reality, absolute sovereignty. The Euphrates continues to flow. Its waters still bathe modern Iraq, pass through regions of conflict, cross lands where entire empires turn to dust. But what the biblical text reveals is not about geography. It is about government, about a schedule that does not fail, about forces that, however terrifying they may be, remain subordinate to a greater will. The mystery of the four angels was not written to feed theories about secret caves or dimensional portals. It was recorded to show something more disturbing and more comforting at the same time. Nothing escapes divine control, not chaos, not destruction, not the forces that one day will be loosed to fulfill their role in the final judgment. The question who bound them finds its answer not in a name but in a principle. The same authority that established the limits of the sea, that determined the orbit of the planets, that marked the birth and death of every star, that authority keeps them restrained. And that same authority will decide the exact hour of liberation, not before, not after, at the determined time. And perhaps that is the most impactful revelation of the apocalypse. Chaos has a deadline, destruction has a limit, and even the most feared angels wait in silence for the voice that one day will say, "Now." To help us continue producing these documentaries and biblical stories, consider purchasing our ebook with more than 50 prayers. It is a way to bless this project and, at the same time, have a spiritual guide for your journey. The link to secure yours is in the description. Until the next video.